6:15 on a Friday morning, February 1975, at a Checker Cab Company garage on Southampton Street, in Boston's South End. The driver, we will call Sal Petrosino, stood at a scratched dispatch window, with two $20 bills folded in his coat pocket. The money was not for gas. It was not for the inspection the Hackney carriage unit required twice a year. It was rent, due before the ignition turned over, for a piece of stamped brass Petrosino did not own. The medallion bolted to the trunk of car 118 belonged to a man Petrosino had met exactly twice, once to sign the lease, once to renegotiate it when it went up. That plate, small enough to cover with one hand, was the only thing standing between Petrosino and an illegal taxi. Without it, the car underneath it was just a car. With it, riveted on, inspected, numbered, it was one of exactly 1,525 vehicles licensed to pick up a fare anywhere in the city of Boston. Petrosino paid the $40. He always did. What he thought about, most Friday mornings, waiting for the dispatcher to hand him the keys, was not the first fare of the shift. It was the number. Not his own number. The 4 digits stamped into car 118's medallion, one of 1,525 plates that had existed since before his father came off the boat at East Boston. Boston had not issued a new one in longer than Petrosino had been alive. Whatever else changed in this city, its skyline, its highways, the airport across the harbor that kept adding terminals every few years, Petrosino was driving on a license the city had stopped writing sometime around when the stock market collapsed. Petrosino turned the key. Car 118, black-roofed, checkerboard-striped, pulled out of the Southampton Street garage and into the cold. Whoever had set that number in 1930 was long retired, probably long dead. What had turned a Depression-era emergency measure into the fixed shape of Boston's taxi supply for the rest of the 20th century, and who, exactly, benefited from a shortage nobody had ever formally voted to keep. Car 118 was a Checker Marathon, the A11 sedan, built in Kalamazoo, Michigan, the same body Checker had been putting under taxi fleets since 1960, deliberately left almost unchanged year to year. Boston had gotten its first Checker dealership in 1959, and by the decade Petrosino was driving, the Checker's boxy greenhouse and oversized doors had become as familiar on Tremont Street as the trolley tracks running underneath it. Fleets didn't buy Checkers because they were handsome. They bought them because the same wide rear door that let a passenger with 2 suitcases climb in without folding themselves in half also meant the car survived 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. For years, an ordinary sedan would not. But the Checker was not what made car 118 legal to drive for hire. The medallion was, and the medallion existed because of a single piece of Massachusetts law, Chapter 392 of the Acts of 1930, which gave Boston's police commissioner authority to license every Hackney carriage, the formal term the city still used, on paper, for a taxi, operating within city limits. Enforcing that law fell to the Hackney Carriage Unit, a division inside the Boston Police Department founded in 1854, the same year as the department itself, making it the oldest specialized unit the department had. In 1930, under the new statute, the unit drew a line, 1,525 medallions, not a floor, a ceiling. Before we go further, if this kind of documentation matters to you, consider subscribing. Every video here goes into one specific aspect of American cab culture: the vehicle, the shift, the medallion, the dispatch, and the specific knowledge of the driver who knew their city in a way that no app has replicated. A number set once, during the Depression, in a single Massachusetts statute, quietly decided how easy it was to get a cab in Boston for the next 2 generations, long after the reasons for setting it that way had stopped applying to the city outside the cab window. And if you drove a cab in this era, or your family did, leave it in the comments. If you drove a Boston cab in the 1970s or 80s, or leased a medallion from someone who did, What did a weekly lease day at the garage actually feel like? Tell us the decade and the fleet. The same regulatory freeze that shaped Boston's cab supply for 60 years has a parallel in nearly every American medallion city. A future video in this series follows how New York's own medallion count stayed just as still, for even longer, before it became the most expensive taxi license in the country. Back to the cab. Nobody at the Hackney carriage unit in 1930 called 1,525 permanent. It was framed the way most Depression-era caps were framed, a response to too many taxis chasing too few fares, a number that could be revisited once the economy recovered. What the Boston Police Department actually did with that number for the next 62 years was almost nothing at all. For much of the mid-20th century, a Boston hack driver did not need to think about medallions at all, because most of them did not lease one. They punched a clock. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the dominant arrangement inside fleets like Checker and Town Taxi was employment. A company owned the medallions, owned the cars, and paid its drivers a wage or a commission, the way any transportation company pays its workers. The medallion, in that structure, belonged to the business. The driver belonged to the payroll. That changed under a decision later reconstructed by Boston Globe, reporting, sometime in the 1970s, the police commissioner, the same office that had set the 1930 cap, lifted a decades-old ban on medallion owners leasing their taxis to independent contractors instead of employing drivers directly. It sounds like a small administrative shift. It was not. Fleets that had carried the cost of a driver's downtime began, over the course of the decade, to hand that cost to the driver instead, in exchange for the right to drive a car whose medallion the fleet, or an individual investor, still owned. Sal Petrosino's $40 Friday payment belonged to this new arrangement, not the old one. He was, in the language the industry would later use, a shift driver. Someone who owned neither the medallion under his trunk lid, nor, in most cases, the car itself, and who paid a fixed fee for the right to keep whatever the meter brought in above it. If Friday was slow, rain that kept people indoors, a hockey game that emptied downtown early, the $40 still came out of his pocket before a single fare had climbed into car 118. If Friday was good, the arithmetic worked the other way, and everything above the lease belonged to him. What this produced, structurally, was two separate classes of person inside Boston's taxi system, doing identical work from the street's point of view, but standing in an entirely different relationship to the 1,525 number. The medallion holders, whose asset appreciated whether or not they ever sat behind a wheel, and the shift drivers, who paid weekly for temporary use of that asset and kept none of its value. Which of those two groups was the frozen medallion cap actually protecting, and did either of them, in 1975, understand it that way? In 1935, 5 years after the cap was set, a Boston taxi medallion changed hands for $50. That figure survives in the historical record precisely because it later became almost impossible to believe. A scarce asset, backed by a hard ceiling in a growing city, does not stay cheap, and Boston's medallions did not. Within Petrosino's own driving years, medallions that had cost the equivalent of a used bicycle during the Depression were worth many times that. The trajectory, once laid out decade by decade, only pointed one direction. Every medallion Boston refused to issue after 1930 made every medallion already in circulation worth more. For a driver who managed to buy one outright rather than lease, that appreciation was real money and real security. A medallion could be borrowed against, willed to a family member, sold at retirement for a sum a Boston hack driver's wages alone would never produce. This is the part of the medallion story that gets told most often because it has a satisfying shape. A driver buys a piece of brass, drives it for 20 years, sells it for a small fortune. It happened. It happened often enough to keep the idea alive inside every garage in the city. What that version leaves out is the arithmetic facing everyone who did not already own one. A fixed number of medallions, combined with a city whose population and workforce kept growing, meant the entry price for a Boston taxi medallion rose independent of anything the driver himself did. Independent of skill, independent of hours worked, independent of how well he knew the streets. The value was not created by driving. It was created by scarcity, and scarcity was a number the Hackney carriage unit had set once, in 1930, and left alone. Petrosino did not own Car 118's Medallion, and by the arithmetic of the 1970s, buying one outright was no longer a bicycle-sized decision. What did it mean, for a city's entire taxi supply, that the price of entry into legal driving had climbed that steep? And who exactly had decided that this was an acceptable cost of keeping the number where it was? While the medallion count sat still, Boston itself did not. Logan International Airport, a few miles across the harbor in East Boston, entered what aviation historians describe as its jumbo jet era in the summer of 1970, when Pan Am began daily 747 service to London. Terminal C, the building that would remain the airport's oldest active terminal for decades, had opened in 1967. Terminal B followed in 1974. Every one of those additions meant more arriving passengers standing at a curb with luggage, looking for a cab. And not one of them meant a single new medallion for the fleet meeting them. The same fixed supply that strained at Logan strained harder in neighborhoods farther from downtown. A cab circling for fares naturally gravitates toward where fares are dense and reliable. The financial district at rush hour, the theater district at closing time, the airport curb during a heavy arrival bank. A driver paying a fixed weekly lease, like Petrosino, had every financial incentive to spend his 12 hours where the meter clicked fastest, and very little incentive to drive out to a residential neighborhood on the strength of a single phone call that might not be there when he arrived. Urban historians and civil rights researchers documenting cab access patterns in American cities through this period describe this dynamic consistently. A fixed, scarce supply of licensed cabs does not distribute itself evenly across a city. It concentrates where the money is thickest, and it thins everywhere else. Boston's 1,525 medallions were never enough to serve every part of the city equally, even in 1930, when the city was smaller. By the 1970s, with Logan's passenger counts climbing and the outer neighborhoods growing, that same fixed number was being asked to stretch across considerably more demand than it had been set for 4 decades earlier. Nobody voted to make cab service harder to find in the neighborhoods farthest from downtown than in the Back Bay or the financial district. The 1930 ceiling did that on its own, simply by staying the same size while everything around it grew. What does a regulatory number that never adjusts actually decide once enough time has passed? And who ends up making that decision for it? While the medallion count sat still, Boston itself did not. Logan International Airport, a few miles across the harbor in East Boston, entered what aviation historians describe as its jumbo jet era in the summer of 1970, when Pan Am began daily 747 service to London. Terminal C, the building that would remain the airport's oldest active terminal for decades, had opened in 1967. Terminal B followed in 1974. Every one of those additions meant more arriving passengers standing at a curb with luggage, looking for a cab. And not one of them meant a single new medallion for the fleet meeting them. The same fixed supply that strained at Logan strained harder in neighborhoods farther from downtown. A cab circling for fares naturally gravitates toward where fares are dense and reliable. The financial district at rush hour, the theater district at closing time, the airport curb during a heavy arrival bank. A driver paying a fixed weekly lease, like Petrosino, had every financial incentive to spend his 12 hours where the meter clicked fastest, and very little incentive to drive out to a residential neighborhood on the strength of a single phone call that might not be there when he arrived. Urban historians and civil rights researchers documenting cab access patterns in American cities through this period describe this dynamic consistently. A fixed, scarce supply of licensed cabs does not distribute itself evenly across a city. It concentrates where the money is thickest, and it thins everywhere else. Boston's 1,525 medallions were never enough to serve every part of the city equally, even in 1930, when the city was smaller. By the 1970s, with Logan's passenger counts climbing and the outer neighborhoods growing, that same fixed number was being asked to stretch across considerably more demand than it had been set for 4 decades earlier. Nobody voted to make cab service harder to find in the neighborhoods farthest from downtown than in the Back Bay or the financial district. The 1930 ceiling did that on its own, simply by staying the same size while everything around it grew. What does a regulatory number that never adjusts actually decide once enough time has passed? And who ends up making that decision for it? For 62 years, from 1930 to 1992, the number 1,525 did not move. Not during the Second World War, when gas rationing thinned Boston's fleet on the road without touching the medallion count itself. Not during the post-war boom, when the city's population and downtown workforce both grew substantially. Not during the 1970s fiscal crisis, and not during the 1980s, when Boston's financial district expanded with new office towers full of exactly the kind of business travelers a taxi fleet exists to move. Whatever pressure built up underneath that number, it built up without changing the number itself. The first crack came in 1992, and it came narrow. The city issued 40 new medallions, not the several hundred that advocacy groups and would-be drivers had been requesting for years, but 40, and every one of them was designated specifically for wheelchair-accessible vehicles. It was, by any measure, a real expansion of who Boston's taxi fleet could physically serve. A driver could not simply retrofit an existing checker or its successor to carry a rider using a wheelchair. So an accessible fleet had genuinely not existed in any meaningful number before this. But 40 medallions against a base of 1,525 was an increase of barely 2.5%, spread across 62 years of a population, an economy, and an airport that had all grown by considerably more than that. Applications for hundreds of additional standard medallions, submitted around the same period, went nowhere. The Hackney carriage unit had no plan to process them. The 1930 ceiling had cracked exactly once, exactly enough to address one specific and genuinely underserved need, and had otherwise held. It would take until the late 1990s and a legal battle that ran roughly a decade before Boston's medallion count rose again in any broader sense. A fight that falls outside the frame of this particular story, but that grew directly out of everything the 40 accessible medallions had, and had not, changed. A driver who spent a career leasing inside a system like Boston's learned something no Hackney carriage unit inspection ever measured: exactly how much of every shift belonged to someone else before it began. Petrosino, and every shift driver like him across 4 decades of checker and town taxi garages, carried a running private arithmetic that the medallion holder never had to think about, and the passenger in the back seat never saw. How many fares to clear before the lease was covered. How a slow Tuesday afternoon threatened a Friday's whole shift. How a city built on a fixed number of licenses quietly pushed every ordinary risk of the business downward, onto the person actually behind the wheel. That knowledge was never written into any regulation the Hackney carriage unit enforced. It lived entirely in the shift drivers working under the 1930 ceiling, one 12-hour stretch at a time. What Boston's frozen medallion count ultimately produced, by the time the 20th century ended, was not a taxi shortage in any single dramatic moment. No strike, no headline crisis, no single day the system visibly broke. It produced something quieter and more durable, a permanently constrained supply that shaped who could become a driver, how hard a fare was to find outside downtown, and how much of a Boston cabbie's income went, every week, to somebody who was not driving. When rideshare platforms arrived decades later and began recruiting drivers with no medallion requirement at all, They were not introducing Boston to the idea of a driver working for a fee out of every fare. Boston's shift lease system had been training drivers into exactly that arithmetic since the police commissioner's decision in the 1970s. What rideshare removed was the fixed weekly number due before the ignition turned, and the 60-year-old ceiling that had made owning one of only 1,525 pieces of brass worth as much as a house. If this channel is worth subscribing to, that's how you tell us. A number set once, during the Depression, in a single Massachusetts statute, quietly decided how easy it was to get a cab in Boston for the next 2 generations, long after the reasons for setting it that way had stopped applying to the city outside the cab window. And if you have a cab story from this era, as a driver, as a regular passenger, as someone whose city this was, write it in the comments. If you drove a Boston cab in the 1970s or 80s, or leased a Medallion from someone who did, what did a weekly lease day at the garage actually feel like? Which city? Which decade? Which shift? Sal Petrosino, the composite driver whose Friday mornings framed this account, is not a person the Hackney Carriage Unit's records will ever produce, because no single record like him survives. What the records do show, reliably, for anyone who checks, 1,525 medallions, issued from 1930 onward, 40 more added in 1992 for accessible vehicles, and nothing else in between. What the records don't show, what a Friday morning at a Southampton Street dispatch window actually cost a driver who did not own the brass under his own trunk lid. What a slow Tuesday did to a Friday's arithmetic. Which decade the ceiling stopped feeling temporary and started feeling permanent. That went with every driver who ever paid the lease and never wrote it down. The next driver who took the shift learned it the way they all had, by showing up, by paying the $40, by doing it enough Fridays that the number on the trunk lid stopped being a mystery and became simply the cost of the job.